Hey there. So, got a little introduction here. Human lives are short and frail. No sooner than we take our first breath, that countdown begins to where, in less than a century's time, that frail breath we have is going to expire, and the tape of culture and civilization is just going to roll on unhesitatingly. Because we were allowed, for only a few fleeting moments, we were allowed to stretch our ginger lifespan over the gears, the sharp-edged gears of momentary time. That's humanity. So how long has it been like this for us humans? When did this story of death and transitory breath begin? So that's my introduction here. We've been talking last several videos, we've been talking about Genesis 1 through 4, and so today I'd like to draw our attention to the third creation story and the material that follows it here in Genesis chapter 5, a chapter where the frail human lifespan meets with death and fleeting life, and also meets with the mysterious hope that echoes forth from the resonance of the divine-human relationship, echoes down the distant corridors of primeval time. So let's take a look into Genesis chapter 5. So like I said, this is kind of like the third creation account. We could say this is the brevity version of the creation account for the Adam and Seth genealogy that's going to take up most of chapter 5. So we mostly think of the creation account, quote unquote, we think of as Genesis chapter 1. But then when I talked about Genesis 2, I pointed out that we actually have a second creation account that starts in Genesis 2, verse 4. These are the records of the heavens and the earth concerning their creation at the time that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And then it begins. No shrub of the field had yet grown, etc. And then we have the story of the extended story of which includes Adam and Eve. So we could say that was the second creation account. And then we have this story in chapters 3 through 4, which you could call the Adam and Eve and fall story. And I don't know whether we should think of that as the continuation of the second creation story, or whether we should think of this as a third story that starts with now the serpent in chapter 3, verse 1. But regardless, that seems to be kind of a unity, though it has parts to it. It seems to be kind of a unity, including both the fruit portion with the serpent and the fruit and the fall per se, as well as the Cain story. So it's the Adam and Eve and Cain story, and then it includes, after introducing Cain and giving the story of God speaking with Cain and all of that, then we have the kind of we could call it kind of the epilogue. It's not the epilogue because the Adam and Eve and Cain and fall story is not done yet, but we have the story of Cain where he has kind of his genealogy, and that's kind of sandwiched in there. And then it culminates with Lamech, who says, well, if Cain is to be avenged 7 times, for Lamech it will be 77 times, because I'll kill somebody who gets in my way. And then the Adam and Eve and fall and Cain story finishes with, in verse 25, Adam knew his wife intimately again. They gave birth to Seth. God has given me another child in the place of Abel, since Cain killed him. A son was born to Seth also, and he named him Enoch. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. And that's the end of chapter 4. And then we get the third creation story. Chapter 5, verse 1. These are the family records of the descendants of Adam. On the day that God created man, or Adam, on the day that God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female. When they were created, he blessed them and called them Adam, man, Adam. So that's kind of like the introduction for, just like we just had the Cain genealogy a minute ago, like we talk about Cain, and then we say Cain knew his wife, and they gave birth to Enoch, and then we get the genealogy with some little bits of story built in there. And now in this third creation story, we get the creation story kind of as the intro for the Adam genealogy, which is the Adam-Seth genealogy. So in verse 3, Adam was 130 years old when he fathered a child in his likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. Adam lived 800 years after the birth of Seth, and he fathered sons and daughters. So Adam's life lasted 930 years, then he died. Seth was 105 years old when he fathered Enoch. Seth lived 807 years after the birth of Enoch, and he fathered sons and daughters. So Seth's life lasted 912 years, and he died. And you might notice the structure of those first two bits here was the same. Basically, it says this is how old he was when he fathered this son. He lived this many years after that, and he fathered sons and daughters. So his life lasted this long, and he died. And that's the formula, and it says the same thing for his son, and that formula continues kind of in a rhythmical way throughout this chapter. And a lot of commentators notice there's that "and he died" bit that's being repeated here. There seems to be some significance to that, because after all, death was just introduced. And this is a genealogy which is a lot more positive and a lot more Godward than the one that we just saw in the line of Cain in the end of the last chapter. But there's this constant reminder at the end of every iteration here, "and he died." Of course, the exception to that is going to be, the exception to the rhythm as well is this little bit here, starting in verse 21 with Enoch, or as you might hear it pronounced more often, Enoch, in our Americanized pronunciation. But, so, let me see here. Yes. So, now let's take a note here of some of the standout names in this genealogy. So I just indicated Adam and Seth. Those are the standout ones, number 1 and 2. And number 3 is Enoch. And then we get a bunch of names that won't be familiar to most of us, so I won't bore you with reading them. But where it gets interesting is where the rhythm breaks. The rhythm of that pattern breaks, starting in verse 21 with Enoch. Well, we'll start in verse 18 with Jared. Jared was 162 years old when he fathered Enoch. Jared lived 800 years after the birth of Enoch, and he fathered sons and daughters. So Jared's life lasted 962 years, then he died. This is all the familiar rhythm. Enoch was 65 years old when he fathered Methuselah. And after the birth of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and fathered sons and daughters. So there the rhythm just broke. This thing of walked with God just appeared out of the blue. We don't talk that way in this chapter yet until this point. Enoch walked with God 300 years and fathered sons and daughters. So Enoch's life lasted 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not there because God took him. And then we go on. It's like they just throw in this, what was that? And we just go on. Methuselah was 187 years old when he fathered Lamech. Methuselah lived 782 years after the birth of Lamech, and he fathered sons and daughters. So Methuselah's life lasted 969 years, then he died. And this is just a little bit of Bible trivia here. That's the oldest person. Adam lived 930, Methuselah lived 969. Lamech was 182 years old when he fathered a son. He named him Noah. He named him Noah, saying, "This one will bring us relief from the agonizing labor of our hands, caused by the ground Yahweh has cursed." Lamech lived 595 years old after Noah's birth. He fathered sons and daughters, so Lamech's life lasted 777 years, and he died. Noah was 500 years old, and he fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And that's the end of the chapter in the English Bibles we have here. You could say that the beginning part of chapter 6, maybe through verse 8 or something. I'm not sure exactly where the division point would be, but what I was reading, it seems like it's generally agreed that this story here, this section really goes on into the beginning of chapter 6. But we'll end there because we're using the English chapter divisions here. But so we have these standout names in the line here. Numbers 1, 2, and 3, Adam, Seth, and Enoch, or Adam, Seth, but and then number 7, Enoch. Number 8, Methuselah. Number 9, Lamech. He stands out because he's the one who looks to Noah with this kind of messianic expectation. He names him for, I'm pretty sure Noah basically means relief. So the footnote in the HCSB on the word relief, the footnote says, the Hebrew word translated, bring us relief, sounds like the name Noah. So he named him basically in a messianic way. He's hoping to God through his offspring, his seed, to go back to Genesis chapter 3. So the standout names in this genealogy here are 1 and 2 and 7, Enoch, and 9, Lamech, and 10, Noah. It's interesting to compare this. Before I get to that, I want to make a comment as well. This chapter really has some of the most head-scratchingly brief and ambiguous little bits in it, just kind of embedded in there as though they're just normal. And specifically, I'm talking about verse 24, Enoch walked with God, and he was not there because God took him. Or as the King James puts it, and he was not because God took him. It's like, what? So specifically that, and then verse 29, Lamech named him Noah, saying, this one will bring us relief from the agonizing labor of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed. And in a way, this kind of reminds me of the developmental lacuna implied by chapter 4, verse 26, where it says, at that time people began to call on the name of the Lord. So like there's this developmental body of stuff that could be said, this massive part of the history that's being remembered here. And there's just this little blip that the writer put in here. He's not necessarily implying that there's more that he could tell us if he wanted to. He's not necessarily implying that. Maybe he is, but he's definitely implying that somebody could tell that story, that there's something there to be told. And the same thing applies to chapter 6, verses 1 through 2, the bit about, mankind began to multiply, the sons of God and the daughters of men began to marry each other. And we look at that and we say, what? What the heck is going on there? So this fascinating little bit here, these little things thrown in there, we could say these are the post-primeval, if we think of Adam and Eve and the fall and God speaking to Cain, we think of that as the primeval period. We could say that these little bits here are the post-primeval mysteries, forgotten to time, remaining only as sacred teases from God to us, as though God winks and says with a subtle smile, there's more where that came from. You have no idea. And you can't have an idea. In a way, Job 38 feels a little appropriate here. If we wanted to open up, I'm not going to do it, but if you wanted to open up Job 38 and just start to read when God says to Job, so where were you when the stars sang for the first time? Where were you when the foundations of the world were laid? Or similarly, the Job's wisdom poem, where he talks about how we burrow down on the ground trying to find gold, and wisdom is deeper than that, and only God is at the root of wisdom. There's definitely, when you read these early chapters of Genesis and you see these little echoes of something that is lost to time for us completely, there's a little bit of a echo there of mystery and just how little we know and will ever know while we're down here under the sun, to use that phrase from Ecclesiastes, under the sun. So this chapter is quite something. This is not just a genealogy. Most of us, you're reading through the Bible, maybe you're reading it for some kind of reading plan or something. You get to chapter 5. Let's say chapter 5 is the chapter for the day. It's very easy to say to yourself, oh, come on, it's just a genealogy. But this chapter is not just a genealogy. So, those standouts from the Seth line. Now, what's interesting as well as you look at the Seth line is there's a couple of names that are repeated from the Cain line. So you might recognize some of the names. Cain's first son in chapter 4 was Enoch. And of course, Enoch is one of the main characters. He's number 7, the 7th from Adam, who is a big deal in chapter 5. Same name that was used for the son of Cain. And then Lamech stands out because Lamech was a big deal in chapter 4. He's number 6 after Cain, the 6th from Cain, and he's the one who kind of takes the idea of what we think of with Cain, and he takes it to the nth degree unashamedly. And he's got that poem, and he's got that poem. And the father of Lamech in chapter 4 was Methuselah, and in chapter 5, the father of this other Lamech is Methuselah. So a very similar name. And the 7th from Cain is basically this threefold musicians and artisans and herdsmen. And herdsmen are significant because Israel originally, at least with Jacob, who was named Israel, at that point they were nomadic herdsmen. So the 7th from Cain was the father of nomadic herdsmen, and basically the father of music and the father of artisanship. So chapter 4, verse 20, Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of the nomadic herdsmen. His brother was named Jubal. He was the father of all who play the lyre and the flute. Zillah bore the other wife of Lamech. Zillah bore Tubal-Cain, who made all kinds of bronze and iron tools. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. And that's really the end of the genealogy, and then they give you, as the end cap, they give you this poem of what Lamech said to his wives. Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, pay attention. For I killed a man for wounding me, a boy for striking me. If Cain is to be avenged 7 times over, for Lamech it will be 77 times. All right. So it's an interesting chapter. Now let me get back to, if we compare these in parallel, there's 4 fun ways to compare these two genealogies and the accounts that they represent, to compare them in parallel. We can think of them as, and this is just things that I jotted down as they were coming to me, we can think of them as comparing the 2 heads, the 2 lines, the 2 Lamechs, and the 2 kind of centerpieces or sets of centerpieces or focus. So I think it's really fun to compare the 2 heads. The one in chapter 4 is the line of Cain. The one in chapter 5 is the line of Adam through Seth. But what makes it interesting to compare these, and we can think of it as the line of Seth, even though it actually starts with Adam. But it's interesting because the heads of these 2, we have Cain, who killed Abel, and the second one is Seth, who's in the place of Abel. We got the one who killed Abel, and we got the one who's in the place of Abel. And if we think of it as the extension of the seed theme from chapter 2, it's kind of like we have Cain, who's the false hope, and then we have Seth, who's kind of this open-ended, continued hope. So kind of to put this in brevity, we could say in chapter 4, we've got here Adam's sin, because Cain is kind of the culmination of the sin. Adam's sin, and then the next one, chapter 5, is Adam's hope. Chapter 4 gives us the end of the Adam and Eve and fall story, and so this genealogy here at the end is Adam's sin. And then chapter 5, this next story, introduced by this 3rd creation account, this is basically Adam's hope. So it's fun thinking about it as the 2 heads put here in parallel, these 2 very different ones. And we can think of it as the 2 lines, because basically we have, in chapter 4, we look at this line and we're seeing kind of a more worldly orientation. Of course, it's culminating with Lamech, who is the epitome of the worldly orientation. But the 7th, if we think of 7 as having significance, it's actually not particularly Godward. Now, they don't tell us what the fruits of the musical and artisan type art, stuff goes toward, but it doesn't tell us that this is worshiping God. So really we can read this line and kind of is reflecting kind of a worldly orientation, whereas definitely in chapter 5, these highlights suggest to us that what this is emphasizing, or what tends to be the pattern, or at least what we're noticing in it, is an orientation that's more about the divine-human relationship. So it's more spiritual orientation, to use spiritual in the sense of, orienting toward God. And then I think it's really fun to think about the 2 Lamechs, because they have the same name, but they're completely different characters. Anybody who wants to suggest that this is some kind of like it's the same person and the text is corrupted or something, to suggest that these are the same characters. If you want to suggest Methuselah is actually Methushael, that might be easier to do. But to suggest that Lamech chapter 4 is Lamech chapter 5 would be a little difficult to do. So in a way, and I pointed out when I talked in chapter 4, I pointed out that it's kind of like Lamech is basically saying, I'm going to be my God, or be our God, as he says to his wives. It's kind of like that's the sense of what's going on here, particularly because he references God's mark on Cain in verse 24, and then he kind of takes it to himself, and so the divine passive is used if Cain is to be avenged, and then he basically puts that for himself. Then for Lamech, it will be. So by implication, the spirit of the divine passive, he's basically saying, I am the God here who is protecting me. Whereas Lamech is bringing up this kind of messianic motif in such a way that we might read it and be a little startled. I don't know if you've seen any of the Star Wars films, which are pretty much imbued in our culture, so you probably have. But when you watch episode 1, which I haven't seen for forever, I think I only saw it once, but there's a messianic motif, definitely inspired at least somewhat from Christianity, but there's this messianic motif where Anakin supposedly is going to be the Messiah. And if you're watching, but you haven't been paying attention particularly to the backstory and the different things that are going on, then you watch that and you see them talking about this Messiah who's going to save us from everything, and you could watch it like I did when I saw it, and you kind of like, pardon me, save us from what? Because they're talking about this messianic figure, and you're kind of looking at it and saying, save us from what? But it's kind of a similar thing here. You're reading through the Bible, and if you're not paying attention in chapter 5, you hear what Lamech is saying, and you're kind of like, save us from what? Because you may not realize that there is this messianic thread. And then you read this and you say, what in the heck is this talking about? Because he has this son, and he pronounces this hopeful, it's not a blessing. It's not like he's actually pronouncing this is going to happen. It's just an expression of hope. He names him Noah in the hope that this is the seed, because it wasn't technically Seth. Seth, by this point, has passed away. He is our, or I don't know if he's passed away by this point, but because these lives go so long that a lot of this blends together. But anyway, so let me just read what I said here. It's kind of like Lamech 1 is, be my God, save myself. Lamech 2 is, look to God, find saving in God. And I can't help as well noticing Methuselah. Methuselah is kind of memorable because when I was a little kid and you learn all the Bible trivia, you remember Methuselah, and you always picture him as this old guy hobbling around, because the trivia point is that he's the oldest person in the Bible. So Methuselah, he stands out, but he's actually not a non-character. He's just a part of the genealogy, but he's not a non-character, because we know a lot about him, actually. We know that his father is Enoch, who, we know 2 things about Enoch, 2 and only 2. He, quote unquote, walked with God, whatever that means, and he was not, because God took him. His son is the father of this guy named Lamech, who has a resounding messianic hope. So Methuselah is not a non-character at all. And I can't help but want to say, be a Methuselah. Both Methuselah and Lamech are, if you really think about it, they are beautiful, jaw-dropping stories. Stories that make your jaw drop when you really get into what you're really seeing. These are 2 stories that speak of hope, active memory, and the reverent upward gaze. And I think it's a pretty cool idea to say, hey, be a Methuselah. Be someone who keeps alive the great tradition of the one God. Be someone who remembers something that rightly causes awe and maybe shapes the direction of your life. Apparently, for Methuselah, and this is something that happens in life, this is just part of humanity, is that sometimes in people's lives, something that is very small and short, that causes awe, that brings somebody into awareness of that which is beyond them, and they can't explain it. And in some ways, it maybe doesn't make any sense at all. But they make some sense out of it. Maybe it makes sense to them. It doesn't need to be interpreted because it kind of interprets itself. Something amazing. And it doesn't happen again. You don't gain sight of it again. It's not part of your life. It was a moment in time. And yet, it stretches on, and it kind of defines your life. It defines the direction. And in the case of Methuselah, that memory of this father who, quote unquote, walked with God, whatever that means. And then he was just gone. And it was known. He wasn't just gone. The being, the transcendent being that he communed with, took it. And nobody ever saw him again. All right, let's go on here. So we talked about comparing in parallel, just for the fun of it, the two heads, the two lines, the two Lamechs, and the two centerpieces, or sets of centerpieces. So this is just me noticing that there's kind of this parallel to the way these genealogies are preserved for us. They're kind of put with certain things kind of emphasized in the structure of it. So the seventh from Adam, Enoch, the sixth from Cain, Lamech, who's kind of the culmination of the spirit of Cain, so to speak. And then there's kind of a significance maybe to the seventh. But in this line of Cain, the sixth is really the most important. The seventh is kind of like a scatter shot. It kind of reminds me a little bit in the visions of the book of Daniel, how we have, I think it's the statue that, I think it was Nebuchadnezzar who saw it in his dream, but it's got the head of gold, and it kind of goes down, and there's different kinds of materials that represent different kings and kingdoms. And then you come to the bottom, and it separates into the toes, because this is when the kingdom is kind of breaking apart. And so this kind of just reminds me of that. Like the important part is not the breaking apart, even though that's the seventh, that's the greatness, and that's when we look, hey, the origin of music and artisanship and the nomadic herdsmen, that's significant, clearly, but the emphasis, and then after the end of it, then we go back and we re-emphasize the sixth really is the most important. We have verses 23 and 24. And then in 7 and 9 and 10, in the other one, Enoch and Lamech, and then Noah, definitely seem to be the centerpieces here. Now, what about this concept of the long years? So let's just take a little detour here. And I kind of thought, as I started reading, I thought, as soon as I read Adam was 130 years old, I thought to myself, man, I should just jump to this right now. People are going to be like tuning out and thinking, whoa, this is bizarre. Of course, it depends who's listening. Some people will be saying this is bizarre. Some people will just be yawning because they already knew it. So I copied out some bits from some commentaries on the topic of the long ages here. So I've got 3 different citations I'll read just to kind of give you so this first one here is a really good brief summary of some of the interpretations. This is from Paul Wright's commentary. He says, there have been several attempts to explain the long lifespans of the men who appear in Genesis 5, but none of these explanations enjoy universal acceptance, and he gives 4 interpretations here. He says, number 1, the numbers should be taken literally, indicating that the great vitality which was present at creation only gradually diminished. Number 2, the lifespans were calculated on a base 6 mathematical system used in ancient Mesopotamia rather than on today's base 10 system. So in other words, the numbers aren't actually large, they're different numbers that are smaller. Number 3, the genealogy is made to resemble various Sumerian and Babylonian king lists, which give high numbers for the reigns of their pre-flood monarchs. So in other words, this isn't actually a historical story in that sense. They're just doing a literary thing, imitating other stories. Number 4, each number represents not the lifespan of an individual, but that of a family line. So when it says Adam lived 930 years, they're actually talking about Adam and his people. John Sailhammer gives 3 interpretations, and he says there are essentially only 3 approaches to the problem. He says, first off, one may read the ages and relative chronologies as an idealization of a long-lost age when life was not as it is today. He says, just as Isaiah envisioned the future rule of the Messiah as a time when, quote, he who dies at 100 will be as though a mere youth, Isaiah 65:20. In the same way, he says, the writer of Genesis may also be idealizing the past instead of the future, idealizing the past with a symbolic exaggeration of the number of years of their lives. Then he goes on and he says, but there is little or no indication in the text that the numbers are to be taken any way other than realistically. So this would be like a symbolic reading. And he says, well, there's nothing in the text to suggest these are symbolic. Number 2, he says, another approach is to insist on a straightforward reading of the list as an actual chronology of the pre-flood era. Though such long ages are considered improbable in today's world, it may be argued that before the flood, conditions were such that unusually long lives were not impossible. And he goes on and he says, but this leaves us with an extremely short time span in which to place not only all the events and civilizations recorded in the early chapters of Genesis, but also all those events known to us from the study of ancient history. He says, if from Adam to the flood is only 1656 years, and then from the flood to Abraham, 365 years, then put those together, then all of the known history of civilization, all the prehistory of the human race must be put within this time period of 2,000 years, up to Abraham. And he goes on, but then he says, number 3, a further approach is to see the 10 individuals listed as representative of extended families, kind of like what we just heard from what Paul Wright listed for his 4th one. The individuals themselves did not live to such old ages, but rather the families and tribes they represent extended throughout those years. One could point to the account of Judah and Simeon in Judges 1 as a similar example. The tribes of Judah and Simeon are treated as individuals, though the text speaks as though Judah and Simeon are individuals. Literally, and Judah said to Simeon his brother, Judges 1 verse 3. He says they clearly represent the activities of the whole tribal units. So that's the 3 that Sailhammer lists, and then the verbiage that he uses to describe them. And so I'm not going to make any comment on what we should necessarily think of those different options there. But I do want to read as well from another commentator, Drew Johnson, gave a really nice little blurb that really emphasizes the more realistic or the more, you could say, literal or straightforward reading. I really like the way he describes it. And think of this just for the sake of imagination. So I'm not saying that we necessarily should take this interpretation. Well, what I want to do is let's think about what it would look like if it was. And I think he does a really good job of giving us some realism to help us visualize that a little better. So here's what he says. He says, in this chapter here, men live a long time in this lineage, over 900 years long. Some scholars think these incredible lifespans are meant to reflect an ancient Sumerian king list. But the dissimilarities between Genesis and the Sumerian document cast doubt on that. Nevertheless, these super long lives do not go unnoticed by the narrator of Noah's story, who states the reason human life is reduced to its current term. And he's talking about 6 verse 3, I imagine. He doesn't say that, but I'm assuming, because in the 6 verse 3 is when it says, and the Lord said, my spirit will not remain with mankind forever because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. And then Johnson goes on, he says, as a matter of genetic science, our lifespan has no absolute limits apart from what is determined by our genes. The caps of our DNA, known as telomeres, appear to control how many times our cell will reproduce. Think about it. A lifespan above 900 years requires just as much scientific explanation as pardon me, I might have misread that. He says, think about it, a lifespan above 900 years requires just as much scientific explanation as a lifespan above 100 years, or 50 years for that matter. Humans live to around a century when health is good. We now know that genetically controlled reproduction of cells sets this limitation. Why is it that our cells just quit reproducing and allow our bodies to literally degenerate, despite the fact that our environment and eating remain the same? Why don't they just keep reproducing the same number of healthy cells forever and ever? Though geneticists hoped that lengthening these telomeres could increase our lifespan, it has turned out to be more complicated. Scientists will continue to puzzle about this genetic limitation on lifespan built into our biology, but the reason for this limitation is cryptically addressed in Genesis 6. God does not want to contend with humans for reasons that aren't entirely clear in the story. So I think that description there, I really like the way he kind of works with the plausibility aspect. I think a lot of us read something like this and we just kind of see fairy tale written all over it. But I think it's good to examine, and I haven't examined thoroughly enough those four options, those 3 or 4 other interpretations, in order to tell you what I think you ought to think to be true. But I really like the approach here of examining the plausibility aspect, which is kind of our way of innately, intuitively kind of reading in the way we naturally, the way it just kind of hits us. And in that interest of just triggering some holy imagination, regardless of which interpretation is correct, let's think about some things that are true, absolutely true, without question. Let's remember some things about humanity and you and me and the world. Let's remember our lives are short. Great swaths of time, like 900 years, are conceivable. And our lives are short. And we are frail and small in keeping with that. Just like God made us physical and small and weak, as opposed to being spirit beings like the angelic and the demonic and the Satan. He made us physical and small and weak in contrast to those, very much in contrast to him. But in the same way, he also made us short-lived. He made us short-lived like grass, here today and gone tomorrow. And we can't stretch a single hand out of the lifespan. We can't stretch a single hand out of that lifespan in which we are held. Let's look at a couple of Bible passages here. So, first off, we see Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, which we just read, when it says, after this Sethite genealogy, the Lord said, my spirit will not remain with mankind forever. They are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. That kind of draws perhaps your attention, draws my attention naturally to Psalm 90, verse 10, because it basically is saying here, humans live 120 years. At that point, the pronouncement is, okay, not 900, 120 years. Psalm 90, verse 10, says instead, our lives last 70 years. Or, if we are strong, 80 years. Even the best of those years are struggle and sorrow. Indeed, they pass quickly and we fly away. And that chapter as a whole is a really excellent reminder of just the nature of reality. Let me just read that for you. Lord, you have been our refuge in every generation. Before the mountains were born, before you gave birth to the earth and the world, from eternity to eternity, you are God. You return mankind to the dust, saying, return, descendants of Adam. For in your sight 1,000 years are like yesterday that passes by, like a few hours of the night. You end their life, they sleep. They are like grass that grows in the morning. In the morning it sprouts and grows. By evening it withers and dries up. For we are consumed by your anger. We are terrified by your wrath. You have set our unjust ways before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days ebb away under your wrath. We end our years like a sigh. Our lives last 70 years, or if we are strong, 80 years. Even the best of them are a struggle and sorrow. Indeed, they pass quickly and we fly away. Who understands the power of your anger? Your wrath matches the fear that is due you. Teach us to number our days carefully so that we may develop wisdom in our hearts. Lord, how long? Turn and have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your faithful love, so that we may shout with joy and be glad all our days. Make us rejoice for as many days as you have humbled us, for as many years as we have seen adversity. Let your work be seen by your servants and your splendor by your children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be on us. Establish for us the work of our hands. Establish the work of our hands. Now, that's not the only passage that sounds like that and gives some of these, if we could say, existentialist type themes in the Bible. That's definitely not the only one. Let me give you a couple others. Psalm 39 gives some very similar concepts. We'll read verses 4 through 9, so not the whole chapter. You, Lord, reveal to me the end of my life and the number of my days. Let me know how transitory I am. You indeed have made my days short in length, and my lifespan as nothing in your sight. Yes, every mortal man is only a vapor. Certainly, man walks about like a mere shadow. Indeed, they frantically rush around in vain, gathering possessions without knowing who will get them. Now, Lord, what do I wait for? My hope is in you. Deliver me from all my transgressions. Do not make me the taunt of fools. I am speechless. I do not open my mouth because of what you have done. Remove your torment from me. I fade away because of the force of your hand. Let's take a look at Psalm 103. See some more similar concepts. And we're just going to read verses 12 through 22, 12 through the end of the chapter. Let's start in verse 11. It says, "For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his faithful love toward those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him, because he knows what we are made of, remembering that we are dust. As for man, his days are like grass. He blooms like a flower of the field. When the wind passes over it, it vanishes, and its place is no longer known. From eternity to eternity, the Lord's faithful love is toward those who fear him, his righteousness toward the grandchildren of those who keep his covenant, who remember to observe his instructions. The Lord has established his throne in heaven. His kingdom rules over all. Praise the Lord, his angels of great strength, who do his word, obedient to his commands. Praise the Lord, all his armies, his servants who do his will. Praise the Lord, all his works, in all the places where he rules. My soul, praise the Lord." And many of us may remember, to go way over to the end of the New Testament, well, kind of the beginning of the New Testament, but the end of your English hard copy Bibles, James chapter 4, verses 13 through 16, a much more familiar passage. "Come now, you who say, 'Today or tomorrow we'll travel to this city, that city, spend a year, do business, make a profit.' You don't even know what tomorrow will bring, what your life will be. You are a bit of smoke." You might remember in the psalm we just read, I think it was 39, where it says, man is a vapor. Well, James picks up on that, he repeats that. He says, "You are a bit of smoke that appears for a little while that vanishes. You should say instead, if the Lord wills, we will do this or do that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. And for the person who knows to do good and doesn't do it, that's a sin. I kind of paraphrase bits of that, but so you know what? Genesis chapter 5, Adam lives 900 some years, etc. And then in the early part of the next chapter, God says, I'm not going to contend with man forever. He's going to live 120 years. We'll call that good. And Drew Johnson points out that we've found, the scientists have discovered it's encoded in our genetics, basically when our cells are going to stop reproducing. And they were hopeful at first they could figure out a way to make us live forever in our bodies that we have. It didn't turn out that way. And then just to add to that, philosophers, secular philosophers talk about, well, hey, if we can find out how to do that, do we really want to do that? Do we really want to have this go on for 900 years? And a lot of philosophers suggest mortality is kind of good for us. And then philosophers and Christian philosophers will add to that and say, yeah, it would be good for us, you know. And then you get something, you know, in literature, you get something like Tolkien, who puts into the words of Bilbo when he is magically allowed to live forever and ever. And he says, it's kind of like my life feels like not enough butter spread over too much bread, because we're not made to live forever this way after the fall. But anyway, there's one thing that we can't miss, no matter what you think about what to do with those 900-year figures. The one thing you can't miss is that our lives are short. And then just to add a little bit of extra grist for the mill of imagination, I'll just say that as far as I'm concerned, stacking of years is definitely conceivable. You know, the plausibility factor, this isn't an inconceivable thing. Consider, for example, your own individual eschatology. That just means the end for you as an individual. Your own life after death, your future at some point will very much dwarf your first 70, 220, whatever years. If you live to be 90, there's going to come a time when just the beginning of your future really just dwarfs that first 90 years. When you look back and you say, yeah, the first 90 years, that was a long time ago, as you're pushing 400. So stacking things up, that is very conceivable. It's reality. And then there's another thing. Just consider for a minute God's point of view or history's point of view. 1,000 years is not some kind of untraversable kind of magical concept. 1,000 years are there every 1,000 years. And the only thing they contain are mere moments, relationships, and bits of time, and bits of things and people, all stacked one on top of another. Whether that's the 1,000 years from the time of Jesus to the early Middle Ages or mid-Middle Ages, whatever 1,000-ish is considered, or whether that's 1,000 years from then to now, roughly speaking. That's all just time stacked on top of one another. Just one thing after another. That's all it is. Generations after one another of these 120, or as the psalm puts it, these 80-year periods. I enjoy, and I think my imagination has maybe been expanded a little by the fun of what authors of science fiction and fantasy tend to do. Tolkien, for example, has these long ages of the elves and the different creatures, and he has people living these time spans that cover spans of history, and then the men, mortal men doomed to die, they live the lifespans that men do. And I think that's good for our imagination, to realize that all these churnings of time, there's nothing inconceivable about there being somebody Just kind of watching and noticing all these generations of people, one after another after another. And I think the portrait of what we see in Genesis 5 seems to be that someone like Adam was kind of watching as cities got built and cultures developed and got torn down. And I mean, there were a lot of people watching. That's the picture, at least, that you get from reading it on the surface. And like I said, I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm not telling you what I believe. I'm just kind of giving you some bits of images that are going through my head right now. And then I would say as well, consider angelic beings. The Prince of Persia, Michael the Archangel, etc. The Satan and his ilk. Think of Gabriel, for example, who shows up in the book of Daniel, and it seems to be the same figure that shows up in the book of Matthew. Presumably, Gabriel lived at least many hundreds of years if he's the same individual in Daniel and in Matthew. And I think most of us tend to assume that angelic beings kind of last more or less forever. Here's the thing. Our lives are short, and these great swaths of time, they're definitely conceivable. They're hard to conceive. There's a lot of things that are hard to conceive. That says more about us than about anything else. We are frail and small. And just like God made us physical and small and weak, He also made us short-lived, like grass, here today, gone tomorrow, and we can't stretch a single hand out of that lifespan in which we are held. May we all say, without reservation or reticence, may we all say, God, you are great, and we are small. And in the shadow of your great majesty, Lord God, may the transitory short moments of my life bring glory and honor to your glorious, gracious will. May that be the words of our mouths. May that be the desire of our hearts.